A single candle sputtered in the vast dining hall of Elmhurst Manor, its flame quivering against the heavy hush of midnight. Rain lashed the diamond-paned windows like a beast denied entry, and the fire in the hearth had long since shrunk to a nest of glowing embers. The grand table, set for 8, bore only 7 guests. One chair stood empty, its damask cushion untouched, the silverware beside it still polished and waiting. That chair had been reserved for Lawrence Bainbridge, the financier-turned-philosopher, a man known as much for his precise punctuality as his disdain for sentiment. But Bainbridge never arrived at precisely 8 p.m., as was tradition at the Elmhurst winter dinner. Lady Honoria Malling had rung the silver bell to commence the evening. The wine had been poured, the pheasant carved, and the conversation had spiraled as it always did from politics to metaphysics and back again. The host, Sir Cedric Malling, was the only one who'd insisted they begin without Bainbridge. "He's a slave to his clocks," Cedric said, frowning. "Something's delayed him. We'll know soon enough." But Lawrence Bainbridge was found at 10:23 p.m. by a footman in the library upstairs, slumped in a leather chair, a copy of Marcus Aurelius open on his lap, his eyes wide and lifeless. There was no wound, no sign of a struggle, no smell, no glass beside him, no scattered belongings, nothing disturbed except for a small silver chess knight placed on the carpet before his foot, gleaming as if polished only moments ago. Dr. Killingsworth, the local physician, declared a sudden cardiac arrest. "Odd for a man of Bainbridge's health," he muttered, "but not unheard of, still." The butler swore he'd locked the library at 6 after stoking the fire, and Bainbridge had not been in the house then. The only keys to the library were in the butler's waistcoat and Sir Cedric's pocket, and both swore they hadn't used them that evening. The news reached Inspector Archibald Fenchurch the next morning, a barrel-chested man with quick eyes and a distaste for nonsense. He arrived under grim skies and grammar assumptions. Fenchurch had known Bainbridge, professionally if not personally, a former intelligence analyst. Bainbridge had many powerful acquaintances and many more secret enemies. "Cardiac arrest?" Fenchurch asked, almost smiling. "And who placed the chess piece?" He began at the dinner table, walking slowly around the untouched place setting. "Everyone dines, but one man doesn't show no call, no note. And then he's found upstairs in a locked room, alone. Not to mention that peculiar token." He paused. "A knight, no less. Tell me, Lady Honoria, did Bainbridge play chess?" "Obsessively," she replied, her voice like a dried leaf rustling. "But never with real people. He only played against himself. Said it was the only way he could guarantee an intellectual opponent. Curious." Fenchurch walked to the hearth. "And the book he was reading, Marcus Aurelius," Sir Cedric said. "One of his favorites." "Of course it was." Fenchurch's voice was dry, and yet, somehow, it opens to a page about justice and deceit. Quite the coincidence. He spent the rest of the day moving room to room, examining hinges, locks, boots by the door, umbrellas, and fireplace ashes. In Bainbridge's coat pocket, left hanging in the hall, Fenchurch found a train stub from Waterloo Station. The date was yesterday. The arrival time, 6:15 p.m. That meant Bainbridge had only reached Elmhurst after the butler had already locked the library. "So either the butler lies," Fenchurch said aloud, "or someone let Bainbridge in after 6, murdered him silently, and returned everything to perfect order, including locking the room again." The guests, now detained by law, gave their statements. Miss Alice Withers, the painter, claimed to have stepped out to smoke around 6:30. By the West Garden, not the main drive. Professor Delaney, the philosopher, noted that Bainbridge had seemed distracted in recent letters. He feared something, or someone. His prose was unusually elliptical. Fenchurch found no fingerprints on the chess piece, only a faint smudge consistent with wool or velvet. But there was one thing. The piece was not part of any known set in the manor. A guest had brought it. Night settled again. Rain resumed. Fenchurch stood by the library door, holding the knight between thumb and forefinger. There are only 2 keys. The door was locked. No signs of poisoning. No one heard a struggle, but the presence of the knight placed purposefully suggests a message, or a signature. He returned to the dining hall, stopping by each guest's room on the way. In the study assigned to Professor Delaney, he opened a desk drawer and paused. A leather-bound notebook, embossed with a crest, "Tonight's crossing swords." Inside, diagrams of chess games, notations, strategies, but one page was marked with a red thread. A puzzle titled "Mate in One Only If the King Moves." Delaney, when confronted, raised a brow. "Chess is metaphor. It's how Bainbridge and I debated." "You debated through puzzles?" Fenchurch asked. "We sent each other problems in letters." He'd reply with counters. "That puzzle," he said, nodding, "was my last message, sent 2 days ago. Yet you've recreated it here. I needed to see it anew." Bainbridge never responded. Fenchurch considered that. What if someone else did? The inspector summoned everyone once more to the library. The fire was relit, the room warmer now but still heavy with death. He placed the silver knight on the table. This piece didn't come from Elmhurst. It was carried in. Someone used it to say something or to prove something, perhaps even to taunt. He turned to Lady Honoria. Was Bainbridge expected earlier than dinner? Yes, he was to arrive by 5. But he didn't. He took the train arriving after 6, so someone lured him into the library. Knowing it would be locked, knowing he'd be alone, Sir Cedric coughed. But how could anyone have known he'd be late? They couldn't. Unless they were counting on it. He looked again at Professor Delaney. "You debated in chess. He never answered your last move, so you made your answer literal. You killed him when he couldn't counter. Checkmate." Delaney's face was impassive. Then he smiled. "You believe I would kill over a metaphor?" "No," Fenchurch said. "I believe you killed a man who betrayed you in more than letters. I found your passport, Professor. You were in Zurich last month, the same week Bainbridge withdrew funds from the Zurich International Trust. I suspect your names were linked." Delaney's hand twitched. "You feared exposure. Bainbridge, for all his logic, had ethics, and perhaps you used that against him, lured him to a private talk, posed it as another puzzle, gave him poison subtle, modern, undetectable, something that mimics cardiac failure." Delaney did not respond. He simply sat back and said, "You cannot prove a puzzle solved unless all pieces are visible." Fenchurch placed the knight on the book of Marcus Aurelius. "Then let's bring the rest of the set into view." Inspector Archibald Fenchurch remained in the library long after the others had been dismissed, the door creaking shut behind the last hesitant footman. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the soft hiss of the fire. He stood before the chair where Bainbridge had died, studying it with the slow patience of a man used to the lies runes whispered. The copy of Meditations was still there, its pages bowed slightly from where Bainbridge's fingers had fallen limp across them. Fenchurch leaned down, his eyes narrowing as he reached for the volume. A faint smear on the corn royal from a thumb, no. It shimmered slightly in the firelight. Wax, straightening. He walked to the fireplace and examined the mantel. 7 candles remained, their wax dripping cleanly down in pale, straight lines. But the 8th, nearest the left, had a smudged base as if someone had used it, then wiped it with a cloth. He touched the wax. It was softer than the others, still warm. That candle had been lit after Bainbridge was found, or just before. He turned and walked a slow circuit of the room. The carpet bore no visible drag marks, no signs of a body being moved. The windows were locked from the inside, the glass fogged with age and storm. Bookshelves lined the walls like silent jurors, and behind one he noticed now a slight gap, just wide enough for Fenchurch ran a hand along the wooden molding. A draft touched his wrist, a hidden panel, cleverly built but slightly swollen from years of disuse. He pressed, and with a reluctant sigh, it shifted open. The passage beyond was narrow, dusty. He stepped through with a match lit, 10 feet along. It opened into the billiards room unused since the war. He emerged behind the tall oak cabinet. Had someone come this way last night? It would explain how Bainbridge entered the locked library. But who had guided him there? Returning to the main corridor, Fenchurch paused as Lady Honoria approached. She was dressed immaculately, but there was tightness in her jaw that had not been there earlier. "You're still working, Inspector? I've found the library has more entries than the floor plan admits." She did not flinch. Old houses collect secrets. Most are dust and rats. Some host murderers. She gave a brief smile, then added, "I thought you might want to see this. She handed him a folded note. "It was slipped under my door this morning." He opened it. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. There was never a knight, only pawns pretending to be kings. No signature, no fingerprint, no watermark. FENCH. URCH held the paper to the light. The corner had a torn edge like it had been ripped from a larger sheet. "Has anyone else seen this?" "Not yet. Keep it that way." He returned to the drawing room, where the guests had gathered again, some under pretense of reading, others of rest. Their anxiety lay in the air like perfume. Fenchurch's gaze moved over them and settled briefly on Alice Withers, who sat curled near the window, sketching absently. "Miss Withers," he said, moving closer. "What are you drawing?" She looked up, startled. "Oh, nothing, really. Just a habit. Helps me think." He held out a hand. She hesitated, then passed him the sketchbook. On the open page was a rough pencil rendering of the dining table. 7 faces, rendered loosely but recognizably, sat around it. The 8th chair remained blank, but in it she had drawn a knight chess piece, standing upright where Bainbridge's head should have been. Fenchurch said nothing. "I just remembered it," she said quickly, "the way it looked on the carpet. It had stuck with me. Did you draw this before, or after Bainbridge was found?" Her voice faltered. "After, of course." He handed it back without a word. The charcoal smudged under his thumb, and he noted something else beneath the drawing. Faint but visible was the ghost of another sketch. He could make out a pair of boots, a hand, a sleeve. Something had been erased, but not thoroughly. He stepped away and returned to the window. The rain had softened now into a steady murmur. His eyes tracked across the gravel drive. The gardener's hut stood beyond the hedge, abandoned since the last snowfall. But what drew his eye was something near the rose trellis, a small indentation in the grass, protected from the worst of the rain. A heel mark, perhaps 2. Standing still, facing the house, someone had waited there. He donned his coat and made his way out, boots squelching softly on the wet path. Reaching the spot, he crouched and examined the mark. Beside it, pressed into the soft mud, was something finer. A glove, no fabric, but not from a hand. A scrap of black silk. He plucked it carefully with tweezers from his pocket. A button was sewn into one edge, a single black mother-of-pearl disc, old-fashioned, evening wear. Female. Back inside, he found Miss Withers gone. The parlor was empty. Fire low. He moved quietly upstairs and knocked at her door. No answer. He opened it. The room was tidy, almost impersonal. On the dressing table, a handkerchief. On the floor, muddy footprints. And on the writing desk, a second knight, identical to the first. He stood there, the rain now nothing more than a hush beyond the glass, and exhaled slowly. Someone was playing a game, but unlike chess, the board wasn't clear. Pieces were moving, unseen, motivations buried beneath layers of civility and silence, but with each detail: the candle, the passage, the sketches, and now a second night. The shape of the truth was emerging. Not yet a full picture, but the lines were forming, and they pointed not only to who had killed Lawrence Bainbridge, but to why he'd come to Elmhurst in the first place. Inspector Fenchurch remained in Miss Withers' room for a few minutes longer, eyes lingering on the second night, identical to the first, yet subtly different in its patina. This one had been handled more recently, more frequently. He slipped it into a cloth pouch without a word and took one last glance around the room. Her trunk sat half open, clothes folded neatly, but in the side pocket of a dressing gown, tucked beneath a sketch pad, he found a third object: a train schedule from Waterloo, marked in red at 5:20 p.m., the very same day Bainbridge had arrived. When Fenchurch finally summoned the household again, they gathered with visible reluctance. The long drawing room now bore an air of courtroom austerity. Rain traced pale lines down the windows, and the fireplace hissed softly. Lady Honoria, ever composed, perched by the mantel. Sir Cedric leaned against a sideboard, feigning patience. Professor Delaney took the far chair, as if the extra distance gave him some unspoken edge. Miss Withers stood by the window, her arms folded tightly. Sketchbook absent from her hands for the first time, Fenchurch began, his voice steady. "Let's review the last hour before Bainbridge was found." Silence. Then Delaney, with the professor's trained rhythm, spoke first. I was in the music room, reading. Alone, yes. I needed quiet after dinner. The noise was, he gave a vague hand gesture, excessive. Fenchurch turned. And you, Lady Honoria? I was in the conservatory. I needed air. Did anyone see you? She raised a brow. You may ask the footman. He passed through twice, bringing in a coat. But I was not hiding. Inspector, Elmhurst is my home. Fenchurch made a note. Sir Cedric, he gave a tight-lipped smile. I was in the cellar. Looking for a particular bottle of claret I thought Bainbridge might like had he arrived. Did you find it? No. Fenchurch waited a beat, then turned to Alice. Miss Withers, I went to the Rose Garden, she said without hesitation. Just after dinner. I needed to walk. I saw no one. I thought I heard someone in the west corridor, but I didn't check. You left the house. I took the side door. I needed quiet, not another round of philosophy. Fenchurch nodded slowly, his gaze shifting from one to the next. Their answers fit, in the way forged coins fit into a purse close enough to pass, but not quite right under scrutiny. He leaned forward slightly. One thing strikes me. Bainbridge was expected at 5. He arrives past 6. No one sees him. Enter, yet he winds up dead in a locked room. Someone must have let him in. Cedric frowned. He had a key. He's been to Elmhurst often. But your butler says the doors were locked by 6, the library earlier still. If Bainbridge entered with a key, the bolt from the inside still wouldn't be explained. The room was locked from within. Sir Cedric. No one answered. Fenchurch turned to Delaney again. You and Bainbridge had professional disagreements. We debated. We disagreed. But I didn't kill him. Inspector, you were in Zurich last month. He was too. Delaney's eyes flashed. You think I followed him? I think someone was afraid he would speak. About funds, about influence, about old friends with new enemies. I think that someone left a chess piece as a message or as a red herring. Again, silence. But this time, Lady Honoria broke it. Inspector, what are you suggesting? That one of us plotted this like a stage play? No, I believe the play has been running for far longer. The performance simply reached its final act. He looked to Alice. You drew Bainbridge's empty chair with a knight for a face. Why, I told you. I remember the piece. But no one described it to you in detail before that, and no one else seems to recall its exact look. Yet your sketch was precise. Alice's face flushed. I saw it myself, before or after the body was found. Her hands tightened. What are you implying? Fenchurch walked slowly to the center of the room. That the versions of events don't match. Someone's timing is wrong. Someone's movements were not what they claimed. And someone placed that night for a reason. The first was in the library. The second I found in your room, Miss Withers, along with a train schedule marked 5:20. Bainbridge's arrival time. Cedric let out a slow breath. Then she let him. And I never saw him, Alice burst out. I didn't. Fenchurch cut her off with a raised hand. You may not have meant to see him, but the evidence says otherwise. You left the house alone. You were near the rose trellis. That's where I found a silk scrap from an evening shawl. Yours, I believe. She said nothing. Delaney cleared his throat. Even if she let him in, how does that implicate her in his death? It doesn't, Fenchurch said. Not yet. But she knew more than she said. That's deception. Lady Honoria narrowed her eyes. You said earlier that Bainbridge feared someone, that he'd become paranoid. Perhaps he took his own life. Fenchurch's voice was flat. Then why leave behind a knight instead of a note? She held his gaze. He was a philosopher, not a dramatist. Even philosophers don't stage deaths in locked rooms without reason. And the room itself tells us something no one else has. The candle. Cedric blinked. What about it? One of them had been recently lit, long after the rest were cold. Only one person knew that room was locked and still lit a candle inside. Fenchurch took the cloth pouch from his coat and opened it. Both nights gleamed in the firelight. 2 nights, 2 symbols, 2 people involved. One who let Bainbridge in, one who arranged his silence, and perhaps one who watched, said nothing, and now speaks too much. Their eyes moved among each other. Suspicion shifted like wind in tall grass. Someone was breaking. Fenchurch saw it. Not a confession, but the ripple before it. And he knew the deception was not a single thread. It was a web. And soon, someone would tear it. Inspector Fenchurch allowed the silence to settle again, watching each of their faces with the quiet detachment of a man who had no interest in assumptions, only in fractures, emotional, verbal, behavioral cracks, in masks, in stories, in the brittle performances everyone now wore like Sunday suits. They were too neat, too willing to sit in a room with a killer and pretend it was still merely rain tapping at the glass that made them uneasy. He turned toward the hearth and stirred the coals with the iron poker, the flames responding like startled breath. Without looking back, he spoke. You all had reason to want Bainbridge gone. That much is clear. But motive, like smoke, spreads. It doesn't point. It curls and hides until the flame beneath it gives it shape. He turned. So let's consider. The flames. Delaney crossed his legs with deliberate calm. You believe multiple people were involved? Fenchurch nodded once. I believe everyone in this room had something to gain from Bainbridge's silence or his absence. But no one story explains everything. That tells me it's not a matter of one guilty party, but of overlapping motives, and someone in this room used those motives to conceal their own. He paced. Take Sir Cedric. You invited Bainbridge, an old friend. Yes, but one who recently questioned your stewardship of the Elmhurst Trust. According to his last letters, your estate has seen better days. The funds are tight. Bainbridge may have discovered discrepancies. Cedric's jaw tensed. He was mistaken. Overcautious, perhaps. But a man as cautious as Bainbridge doesn't mistake financial mismanagement, especially not when it involves family estates and charitable foundations. Lady Honoria interjected coolly. You suggest Cedric killed over money? I suggest Bainbridge may have confronted him, quietly, privately, a word in a corridor, a note. Or perhaps Fenchurch lifted his gaze to Honoria. He confided in someone else first, someone more calculating, someone who would not lose the manor, but own it in Cedric's stead if it fell. Her smile was practiced. You overestimate my ambition. No, he said. I measure it precisely. She didn't look away. Fenchurch continued, shifting his attention to Alice. Then there's Miss Withers, a struggling artist with a modest inheritance tied to Bainbridge's former foundation. That foundation was being reviewed for closure. If Bainbridge had withdrawn support, your funding would vanish. Alice's lips parted. The first true crack in her forehead. I didn't even know about the review until you mentioned it. Perhaps Bainbridge told you that evening, quietly, just before you let him in. That doesn't mean I wanted him dead. No, Fenchurch said. But it meant you had reason to keep silent if someone else did. She flinched as if struck. Delaney shifted uncomfortably. Fenchurch turned to him with a new sharpness. And you? Professor, Zurich wasn't a vacation. You were seeking to stabilize offshore funds that had been quietly blood-dry by a partner. You could no longer trust Bainbridge. You suspected him of betraying you. But the irony is, he was preparing to report you first. He had copies of your letters that might implicate you in more than academic rivalry. Delaney went pale. He wouldn't. He would, and you knew it. That's why you sent that chess problem. One final taunt. One last move before he made his own. Delaney's voice was tight. You're guessing. I've seen the original, hidden in his diary. He wrote a note in the margin. Delaney's last insult. We'll speak to Cedric tomorrow. That landed. Even Cedric blinked. Now the circle had tightened. Motives flared in every corner. Cedric had wealth to lose. Honoria had control to gain. Delaney faced exposure. Alice faced ruin. And none had alibis that withstood pressure. But then, Fenchurch said softly, we have the contradiction. He drew from his pocket a photosepia. Creased at the edge, he placed it on the low table in the center of the room. This was in Bainbridge's wallet, taken 23 years ago. A woman and 2 children. The woman, I believe, is a young Honoria Malling. The boy is Lawrence Bainbridge's son. Honoria's stillness was sudden and absolute. Fenchurch spoke into it. Bainbridge left the child. He paid quietly, provided through foundations and letters, but recently he wanted more, not exposure, recognition. He reached out to the boy. A man now, someone close. Cedric's voice was low, disbelieving. You mean, yes. Fenchurch turned the photo, scrawled on the back. In Bainbridge's hand, Thomas. Let him know I did not forget. Thomas Malling, Honoria's late son, Cedric's adopted heir, and according to the photograph, Bainbridge's biological child. Bainbridge had no children, or so he claimed, Cedric whispered. Honoria's voice was ice. He did, but not publicly, not with me, so he came here to claim his blood. Fenchurch said, to speak to you both, perhaps to demand an inheritance be redirected. That would threaten you both. She looked at him, then no longer composed, but worn and brittle. He came with guilt. She said softly, he came too late. Fenchurch nodded. And someone ensured he wouldn't speak at all. Someone who feared what his truth would unravel. The room was silent again. Delaney stood abruptly. So who was it? Her, Cedric. You've painted every one of us with motive, but you haven't proven a single act. No, Fenchurch said, but the night proves one thing. He lifted both pieces again. There were two, left like calling cards. One in the library, one in Miss Wither's room. But Bainbridge carried a third. It was not found with his body, but I recovered it from the ashtray outside the west door, burnt, but still legible in silver. He removed the final piece from a pouch, charred, twisted, but unmistakable. 3 nights, he said quietly. 3 moves, a warning, a deception, and a signature. Only the killer would try to burn the final piece, but fire doesn't hide guilt, it reveals it. And for the first time since his rival, one of them a single heartbeat late, looked at the piece not with fear, but recognition. That was enough. The motive maze had narrowed to one path, and Fenchurch now saw the door at its end. Inspector Fenchurch watched the subtle shift in Alice Wither's eyes. When the scorched night was placed on the table, it was slight, too small to be called shock, too quick to be guilt, but it was there. Her gaze had darted, not toward the others, but downward, as if counting something that had slipped out of reach. Before he could press further, the door creaked open. Constable Merriweather stepped in, hat in hand, cheeks ruddy from the cold. Inspector, he said, eyes flicking briefly toward the cluster of suspects. Apologies for the interruption, but we've just had something coming. A man was found 2 miles down the road, half frozen, bruised. Says his name is Jasper Kit. Claims he was trying to get to Elmhurst last night to meet Mr. Bainbridge. Fenchurch's brow rose. Did he have proof? More than that, Merriweather said. He had this from his coat. He produced a worn, wax-sealed envelope, torn open at the top but still legible on the front. In Bainbridge's unmistakable hand was written, to be delivered at Elmhurst Manor, urgent. Inside, a single sheet, typed, no signature, but it read like a dagger. Delaney has falsified funding records since 1937. Cedric knows. Honoria buried it. If anything happens to me, start with the night. The room erupted. Delaney springing to his feet, Cedric cursing under his breath. Honoria. Going pale, Fenchurch took the page calmly, scanning it. The words fit so neatly, it was like someone had studied the case from his shoulder. He turned to Merriweather. Where's this Kit now? Under guard. Wants to speak only to you. Hold him there. He faced the room. This confirms much that Bainbridge feared for his life, that someone close to him had reason to silence him. Delaney glared. It doesn't confirm I killed him. This is convenient to convenient, Cedric barked. And yet it's in his handwriting, naming you. What else do you need? Honoria stood but said nothing. Her eyes were trained not on Fenchurch nor on Delaney, but on the scorched chess piece, as if it whispered secrets only she could hear. Fenchurch folded the note carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. It's significant, he said, quietly but not conclusive. Handwriting can be forged, even content can be crafted. If the writer anticipated death, the others began to protest, but he silenced them with a raised hand. No one leaves the estate. Not until I've spoken to Kit. Merriweather, have someone check the typewriter in the study. If this note was written at Elmhurst, the keys will show it. The room emptied reluctantly, one by one, with glances cast back like dogs waiting to see who the leash would fall upon. Alice lingered last, her voice barely above a whisper. He said start with the night. Fenchurch looked at her. He did, and you still think that means me. I think it means exactly what it says, that the night is not just a symbol but a move. When she was gone, he stood alone in the drawing room, turning the note over. Something was wrong. He could feel it. The ink was dry, the folds too precise. The seal had cracked along its edge, as though it had been opened once before and carefully pressed back. He walked to the study. The typewriter sat under its cover, old but functional. Fenchurch lifted the lid. He rolled a test page in, struck a few keys. Then he stopped. The K was slightly misaligned, just a hair higher than the baseline. He compared it with the note. The KS were perfect. He returned to the window, looking out toward the hedge where Kit had supposedly been found. Who was this man? A messenger? A decoy, or worse, an actor, playing the part that would shift the spotlight just enough to let the real hand retreat into shadow? The constable reappeared minutes later. Inspector Kit insists on speaking now. Fenchurch nodded and followed him to the kitchen, where Kit sat bundled in a borrowed coat. Hair damp, eyes bloodshot. You were to meet Bainbridge, Fenchurch began. Why? Kit coughed. Winced, he said he had a job. A courier. Run. Sensitive. Said I'd earn more in one night than a month at the docks. Gave me that envelope. Told me to bring it here. But then someone jumped me. Where? Near the gate. I never saw the face. Got hit from behind. Woke up in the ditch this morning. Fenchurch studied him. Why not go to the police? I thought I'd be blamed. That's why I waited. I only came forward after the news reached the village. The lie was to Neat, to rehearsed. You didn't write the note, did you? No, sir. But you read it before delivering. Kit hesitated. I opened it, yes. I needed to know what I was carrying. There it was. The crack. The reason. The seal had been pressed back. Someone had planned this with him or through him. Fenchurch returned to the drawing room. The others already murmuring among themselves. Delaney, fueled by anger, now paced with the air of a wrongly accused man who suddenly had an exit route. Cedric looked tired. Honoria unreadable. I've spoken to Mr. Kit, Fenchurch said. He confirms receiving the note, but also admits to opening it. That casts doubt on the envelope's chain of custody. Delaney surged forward. But you can't ignore the contents, the name, the facts. No, Fenchurch said. I won't. But I will question how a man supposedly fearful for his life writes a single page accusing you, and not the person who stood to inherit his fortune, his estate, and most damningly, his secret child. He looked directly at Honoria. She did not blink. So now you accuse me. I accuse someone of forging Bainbridge's last words. The evidence is mounting. The note wasn't typed here. The seal was tampered with. The timing of Kit's attack is to Neat. This entire turn of events feels curated, as though someone wanted us to believe the case was solved before it truly was. Delaney sat heavily. Then who, if not me? Then who? Fenchurch didn't answer. Not yet. Because something still didn't fit. The night, the fire, the candle relit, the passage behind the library. Someone had constructed a solution, complete, with villain and motive enough to satisfy the authorities, enough to let the killer vanish. But it was too soon. The game wasn't over. It was just one move ahead. Inspector Fenchurch stood by the window, watching a crow peck at something just beyond the hedges. The manner was too quiet now, stifled, like a breath held too long. The envelope had been the perfect bait, and everyone had lunged for it. But the note hadn't answered the question. It had only distracted from it. He returned to the library. The fire was out. The chair where Bainbridge had died remained in its original position, facing the cold hearth. The chess piece gone, now catalogued and stored. Yet something still clung to the room, something unsettled. He moved to the bookshelves again, letting his hand trail the worn spines. Most were untouched. But in the corner near the hidden passage, he paused. A slim red volume, The Art of Deception, Classical Strategies of Misdirection. It had a bookmark still tucked inside. He opened it and frowned. Inside the pages was a folded clipping, yellowed with age. A newspaper article, barely legible now. Double murder baffles police, body found near chessboard. No suspects named. The date, February 1923. Nearly 30 years ago. A manor in Yorkshire. A woman and her husband found dead, a chessboard overturned between them. A young boy their son discovered hours later, locked in the wine cellar. The names leapt out at him, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Withers. He stared. The name wasn't uncommon, but the article included a photo grainy, but unmistakable. The woman had Alice's cheekbones. The man's eyes were the same pale gray. Alice Withers wasn't simply an artist with a tenuous connection to Bainbridge's foundation. She was the daughter of 2 murdered victims in a case never solved, a child survivor of a mystery that had never been closed. Fenchurch sat heavily in Bainbridge's chair. That old case forgotten, unsolved was more than relevant now. He understood the look Alice had given the night. It wasn't recognition of a murder weapon. It was memory, trauma, the symbol of something she'd seen before. He found her outside near the edge of the rose garden. The wind had picked up, tugging at her scarf. She wasn't sketching now. She was staring into the mist like she expected it to speak. He stopped beside her. "You lied to me, Miss Withers." She didn't flinch. "About what? About who?" You never mentioned your parents or their deaths." "I was 5, she said, her voice hollow. "I don't remember much, but you do remember enough. The chessboard, the pieces, the locked cellar. It was in the article. And Bainbridge had a clipping of the same case in his personal files." Now she turned, eyes fierce. "He kept that?" "Yes, folded inside. A book on deception. Did you know him then?" "No, not personally. But he was there, after." Her voice lowered. "He came with some government man, said he was investigating the deaths, said he was a friend of my father's. I remember his coat. It smelled of smoke. He gave me a chocolate." Fenchurch felt the shift, subtle but seismic. Bainbridge was in intelligence. Before his finance days, that's known. But not that he worked domestic crime. He hesitated. "Do you think he was there as an investigator, or something else?" "I never saw him again. I was taken to an aunt. She didn't want me. You changed your name." "I shortened it. Withers is common, easier to disappear. And yet, 30 years later, you cross paths again here." She looked down. "I didn't plan that. I didn't know he'd be here until I arrived. I was invited by Lady Honoria, through a mutual friend. I didn't even want to come." Fenchurch studied her. "But when you saw him, I remembered the smell of his coat. That's all it took. I knew it was him." Her eyes flicked toward the manor. "He didn't recognize me, not at first, but he did later. I think so, after dinner. He cornered me, asked about my past, said he recognized something in my voice. He was going to ask me questions I didn't want answered." "What questions?" She hesitated. "About who really killed my parents." Fenchurch's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know?" She looked at him, and in her eyes there was no fear now, only sorrow. "I've always suspected someone in that investigation was involved. The scene was too clean, to deliberate. Like a game, my father loved chess, but the board was set up wrong. The knight was facing the wrong way. That always stayed with me, like someone wanted to leave a message or mock him." Fenchurch felt the chill reach his bones. "So you think Bainbridge wasn't there as a friend?" "I think he came to bury something, or someone. And now, 30 years later, you were both in the same house, a house with its own secrets." Alice looked away. "You think I killed him. I think you might have had reason to, but I don't believe you did." He took a breath. "Because someone else knew about the clipping. Someone else who knew Bainbridge's connection to that case. And someone who knew you might remember it, if reminded." He turned and began walking. The manor loomed again. The chessboard, the night, the locked room. It wasn't about money, not entirely, nor power, nor even revenge, in the usual sense. It was about history, a crime long buried, a witness who had grown up, a man who returned to Elmhurst to make amends or prevent the truth from surfacing. But someone else had known the moment he arrived that Bainbridge's silence was not enough, that if he remembered the girl, he might confess the past, and the only way to ensure the truth never escaped was to kill him again, just as carefully, just as silently. Inside the manor, Fenchurch went back to the library. He stared once more at the bookshelves, the red volume, the clipping, the hidden passage. Then his eyes caught something he'd missed before, a single book out of place titled Endgame. Inside, a note in Bainbridge's hand, dated just 3 days before his death. Honoria knows, she always has. But it's Cedric. I fear now. He's taken steps I can no longer track. The night was just the beginning. If anything happens, Alice must remember. Fenchurch felt the shift again this time, final. The killer was still here, still watching, and their crime hadn't begun with Bainbridge's murder. It had begun 30 years ago, and was only now reaching its final move. The storm had softened into a misting drizzle, but inside Elmhurst, tension pulsed like a low, constant hum beneath every floorboard and whisper. Inspector Fenchurch moved quietly through the halls, past ancestral portraits with blank, judging eyes. His mind retraced the sequence of revelations, clues long buried, now unearthed and slippery with ambiguity. Bainbridge's note in Endgame confirmed what he'd already sensed. The murder was tied to history, not just between Alice and Bainbridge, but among the very walls of Elmhurst itself. But motive alone did not reveal a killer. The lie, the mask, those had to be cracked, and he knew that facts alone wouldn't do it. He returned to the drawing room, where the others had gathered once more. Summoned with the thinnest of pretexts, a new development, he had said. They came as expected. Honoria, poised, unsmiling. Cedric, lips thin with control. Delaney, brittle with indignation. Alice, arms crossed tight, eyes distant. Fenchurch carried with him a small object wrapped in cloth. No one asked what it was. I'd like to perform a small exercise, he said, moving to the center of the room. Something unorthodox, but occasionally useful. No objections, only wary glances. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal the scorched knight, the third piece, the one partially destroyed in the fireplace tray. The silver etching still caught the light despite its blackened shell. I want each of you, he continued, to hold this piece, just for a moment. Look at it. Think about what it means. Then pass it on. No comments, no questions, just observation. Cedric scoffed. What are we meant to prove? That we're moved by charred trinkets. You'll prove nothing, but perhaps I will. Fenchurch handed the piece first to Cedric. He turned it over with a faint sneer, his thumb brushing the edge. It's a chess piece, Inspector. Symbolic, perhaps, but hardly a weapon. He passed it to Delaney, who accepted it stiffly. Philosophers often talk of knights, Delaney muttered. The illusion of power on a board of false choices. Hold it longer, Fenchurch said gently. Delaney's fingers tightened slightly. He was sweating, just a little. Then the piece moved to Honoria. She didn't flinch, but she didn't look at it either. She held it between the fingers like it was a specimen under glass. My husband had a set just like it. Weighted, cold. He used to say the knight was the most dangerous piece. It moved unlike anything else. Never directly, never simply. She passed it quickly to Alice. Alice took it with a strange stillness, her thumb resting on the singed head. For a moment, she didn't move at all. Then she held it closer to her face and whispered, "This wasn't from Elmhurst set." Fenchurch froze. Alice looked up. "The patina's wrong. And the weight. This isn't one of ours. It was brought here." Fenchurch stepped forward. "You're certain?" "I helped polish them when I arrived. The knights had copper bases. This one's lead. Heavier, older." He turned to Honoria. "Is that true?" She didn't answer immediately. "It's possible. I haven't seen this set in years." "Interesting," Fenchurch said, retrieving the piece and wrapping it again. "Because I examined the original set in your husband's study. All the pieces matched except the missing knight. And that knight was copper, as Miss Withers said. Not lead." He paced slowly. "So this piece wasn't burned to destroy evidence. It was burned to suggest connection. It doesn't belong. It's a plant." Delaney blinked. "So whoever placed it wanted us to think it was part of the murder scene." "Yes," Fenchurch said. "And that raises a question. Who would go through such lengths to manipulate the symbol? That tied everything together." He turned sharply. "Honoria, you knew about the knight. You knew the old case haunted Bainbridge. You invited Alice here, whether through a friend or a servant, knowing she would recognize him. You told Cedric nothing because you needed him uninformed, plausible, distracted." She didn't move, but her gaze hardened. Cedric's eyes flicked to her. "Wait, are you saying she..." "I'm saying she orchestrated the room. Not necessarily the murder, but the conditions, the roles. He stepped forward. You relit the candle in the library. Why? Not to read, not to grieve, but because you found the body first. You didn't lock the door, you unlocked it. You found Bainbridge already dead and set the stage. The night, the candle, the illusion of time. Honoria finally spoke. Why would I do that? To protect someone, or to direct suspicion away from someone, but not for justice. Silence, thick. Then a quiet voice broke through. I saw her, Alice said. That night, in the west corridor, she had a cloth bundle in her hand. I thought she'd gone to the garden, but she went the other way. Honoria turned slowly. You little liar. I didn't say anything, Alice said, because I didn't know what it meant. But now I do. You set the night. You staged the room. Delaney interjected. But then who killed him, if not her? Fenchurch held up the night one last time. This piece doesn't belong to Elmhurst, but it does belong to someone. I checked. The library registry in town. This night isn't English-made, it's Czech. From a limited edition war memorial set. And that set was gifted to one person in this house. He looked directly at Delaney. The professor stammered. That's impossible. It's not. Bainbridge recorded the gift in a letter to your mentor thanking him for the set, and saying he was passing it on to a brilliant mind deserving of strategic tools. That was you. Delaney stared. Then I must have misplaced it. Years ago, you didn't. Fenchurch stepped closer. You carried it with you. Perhaps as a token, a reminder, maybe even as a warning. But at some point, it burned your fingers, didn't it? Delaney's mask cracked, just for a moment. A sliver. Bainbridge knew about your falsified funding. He confronted you. Not in anger, but in disappointment. You felt cornered, betrayed. You never intended to kill him, but when he refused to stay silent, you acted. Quick, quiet. Chess taught you that sometimes the knight must leap the wall. Delaney sagged slightly, as if the air had left his lungs. He would have ruined me. Everything I built, everything I earned. You built it on lies, Fenchurch said. Delaney laughed. Bitter, so did he? Honoria stood, expression blank. So what now, Inspector? Fenchurch didn't answer immediately. He folded the knight in its cloth and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the wind scratched against the windows like fingernails. Now, he said, we've finished the game. One more move left. The morning light crept over Elmhurst Manor like a guilty whisper, flattening shadows but bringing no peace. The storm had passed, but a different kind of pressure had taken its place, quieter, more dangerous. Inspector Fenchurch rose early, fatigue knotting the muscles in his neck, and crossed to the small writing desk in his guest room, where the night the check piece lay wrapped in cloth, within a sealed evidence pouch, or had. His heart jolted. The pouch was gone. He stared at the empty space where it had sat just hours before. No signs of forced entry. No window opened. The door had been locked from the inside all night. He turned in slow, calculated silence, checking drawers, the hearth, even beneath the desk. Nothing. The night had vanished. He straightened, heart steadied now but colder. Someone was trying to close the board before the final move could be made, and someone in this house was clever enough to do it without leaving a trace. Downstairs, the house had begun to stir. The staff were setting breakfast, their movements slow and uncertain, as if even the clinking of porcelain might disturb something sinister in the walls. Fenchurch descended and found Merriweather already, waiting in the hallway, hat in hand, a concerned crease on his brow. We've just had a problem, sir, Merriweather said in a low voice. The file from the village archive, the one with Bainbridge's letters, and the typewriter sample, it's gone. The clerk swears he left it on his desk overnight. This morning, it was missing. Fenchurch closed his eyes. The night, the letter, the keys, all 3 pieces, all stolen or compromised. This wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. We're being outmaneuvered. He muttered. You think it's Delaney? I think Delaney is a man unraveling, but not clever enough to clean the trail so thoroughly. Not alone. Merriweather frowned. Then who? Fenchurch didn't answer. Not yet. He moved through the house, checking windows, locks, listening to every creak of wood underfoot as if the walls themselves might confess. When he reached the drawing room, he found Alice by the fire. Not sketching this time, but staring into the flames. She didn't turn. Something's gone wrong. You feel it too. I heard someone last night, outside my door. I thought it was a dream. The handle moved, just for a moment. Then it stopped. He nodded slowly. They're tying up threads. Evidence is vanishing. The letter, the piece, even the clerk's file. Why now? Because we're close. She turned. Closer to what? To someone who never expected us to see the whole picture. His eyes narrowed. Someone playing to games at once. Footsteps behind them. Cedric entered, arms folded tightly. Over his chest, eyes bloodshot. Is this about Delaney again? Because he's packed a bag. Claims he's leaving for London the moment you release him. Fenchurch ignored the bait. You keep track of your guests, Cedric. Cedric bristled. To a point. Why? Because someone's moving through this house like they own it. Last night, a very specific object was removed from my room. No signs of break-in. They had a key. Or were already inside. Cedric paled. You're saying one of us. Fenchurch's eyes fixed on him. That's exactly what I'm saying. There was a sharp knock at the door. A housemaid stood there, hesitant, eyes wide. Sir, there's something you need to see. In the cellar, they followed her down narrow stone steps into the earth beneath Elmhurst. The air was thick and old, dust rising in slow spirals. Near the far wall, beside rusted wine racks, a panel had been pulled loose. Behind it, a small cavity inside, a fireproof case yard on one side. Open.empty.fenchurch knelt, running his gloved hand along the interior. Scorch marks, ash. Something had been burned here recently, not completely, but deliberately. There's residue. Here, he murmured. Paper, metal, something hard engraved, maybe. He rose. This is where the night ended up. Cedric blurted, then it's gone, not entirely. Fenchurch lifted a small shard from the edge, half melted, but unmistakably the curled base of the night piece. They didn't have time to finish the job. He looked at Alice. You said the piece didn't match Elmhurst's set, that it came from Delaney's War Memorial set. She nodded. He held up the twisted metal. Let's see if he still has the rest of that set. They found Delaney in the east corridor. Bag at his feet, coat on. He looked up, caught mid-motion, like a child caught lifting sweets. Leaving so soon, Fenchurch said quietly. Delaney tensed. You said I wasn't under arrest. You're not, but you are still a suspect, and I'm missing something from your room. Delaney frowned. I haven't touched your things. I mean your things, specifically, a chess set. Gifted by Bainbridge, check, limited edition. Delaney hesitated. It's not there anymore, is it? Fenchurch said. Silence. You burned the night to erase your connection to it. He continued. Or so you believed. But you weren't working alone. You were never sharp enough to orchestrate the staging. That took a steadier hand. Delaney's voice dropped. You think I had help. I think you had a protector. Fenchurch turned to Cedric. A man like you keeps things clean, manages appearances, protects the family. That's why you left the cellar unlocked last night. Cedric stared. What? I checked the latch. It's rusted, but the marks were clean, opened. Recently. And only someone with authority would know that fireproof safe existed. He stepped forward. Delaney killed Bainbridge in a moment of panic, but you staged the scene. You planted the check night, burned the real one, stole the letter, silenced the archive clerk by stealing the file. Why? Because you couldn't bear another scandal. Not after what happened to your father. Not after what happened to Thomas. Cedric's mouth opened, but no words came. You didn't kill Bainbridge, but you ensured no one could prove who did. Cedric collapsed into the nearest chair, rubbing his face. He came to me after the murder, pale, shaking. I knew immediately. He said it was an accident, a struggle. Bainbridge lunged at him. Did you believe him? I wanted to. God help me, I did. And the cover-up, my father covered worse in his time. I thought I could too. Fenchurch stood back. But you made one mistake. Cedric looked up. You underestimated how deeply Bainbridge's past had infected this house. Alice's past. Henria's silence. Your own inheritance. You were patching holes in a boat already sunk. There was a moment's stillness. Then Delaney, defeated, sank to the floor. You'll never prove it, he muttered. The night's gone. The letter's gone. You have nothing. Fenchurch reached into his pocket and held up the warped shard. I have enough, and more. Importantly, I have your reactions, every lie, every deflection. You both made your moves too early. He turned to Merriweather. Escort Mr. Delaney to the study. Keep him there. And see to it that Mr. Cedric does not leave the grounds. Then he faced the cold air of the cellar, letting it bite into him. The evidence was vanishing, piece by piece, but the game wasn't over, because there was one player still unaccounted for. Honoria, still silent, still watching, and she had yet to show her final move. It was just past 3 in the afternoon when the air in Elmhurst Manor shifted quietly, invisibly, but unmistakably. Outside, a new front of clouds began crawling in over the horizon, flattening the winter sun and washing the world in cold gray. Inside, Inspector Fenchurch stood at the base of the main staircase, watching as two constables escorted Delaney toward the study. The professor's face was pale and sunken, his eyes ringed with the exhaustion of defeat, or something deeper dread. Perhaps Cedric had retreated to the smoking room under watch. Silent as stone, his last words had been, "It was never meant to go this far." Fenchurch believed that, but belief wasn't absolution. Alice Withers lingered nearby, keeping to the fringes of rooms now hollowed out by the truth. And through it all, one absence became increasingly conspicuous: Lady Honoria. No one had seen her since breakfast. Fenchurch climbed the stairs slowly, listening to the creak of wood and wind rattling the manor's upper windows. He checked her. Suite empty. Drawing room. Nothing. Her coat was still in the cloakroom, boots untouched. No carriage had been requested. He moved down the corridor toward the west wing, the hall narrowing, dimming. Then he saw it. A ribbon of blood no thicker than a thread, curling from the base of a door. Fenchurch drew his revolver. Slowly the door was unlocked. It groaned open an inch at a time under the weight of silence. Inside, the linen room. Narrow, windowless, shelves stacked with folded towels and bed covers. And there, crumpled in the corner, partially covered by a fallen sheet, Alice, not breathing. Fenchurch dropped to his knees. Her pulse fluttered against his fingertips, shallow, faint, but there, a cloth lay beside her, damp with something sharp-smelling. Chloroform, not blood. A faint bruise at her temple suggested a struggle. She hadn't walked here. She'd been dragged. Constable. Fenchurch's voice rang like a gunshot through the corridor. Footsteps thundered upstairs. Merriweather reached him seconds later, eyes wide. "She's alive," Fenchurch said. "Barely. Get her to the kitchen, quickly. Alert the doctor. And lock every door in this house, now." As Merriweather called down for assistance and lifted Alice carefully, Fenchurch scanned the room. No sign of forced entry again. No fingerprints visible. But the edges of the sheet bore muddy smudges, not old earth, but fresh, like someone had stepped in garden soil recently turned. Back in the hall, the manor erupted into alarm. Servants dashed to and fro, calling out names, accounting for guests. The constables had locked the main exits. Everyone else was present. Everyone, except Honoria. Fenchurch stormed to the master's suite once more, this time flinging open the wardrobe. It was empty, not just of coats, but everything: drawers pulled, jewelry gone, bags missing. She hadn't vanished. She had fled. He spun to Merriweather, the footman. "Cooper. Where is he?" "In the servant quarters, sir." "Get him." He was her confidant. If she's gone. He helped her. But even before Merriweather returned, Fenchurch's mind had moved ahead. The broken trail was becoming clearer. The game had never been Delaney's to play, nor Cedric's. They had been pieces useful. Broken men prodded into action, and then left to absorb the weight of guilt. Honoria had always stood just behind the curtain, stage managing the collapse. She knew Delaney's weakness. She knew Cedric's desperate obsession with legacy. And she had watched them squirm under pressure while she quietly erased the map. The check knight had been her addition, not just a symbol but a redirection. A sleight of hand. She planted it in the library, confident that its foreign weight would mislead, and that Alice, the only one sharp enough to spot the difference, would become a liability. And now Alice had nearly died. The motive, power, reputation, but more than that, control. Honoria had managed every inch of Elmhurst, from her husband's finances to Cedric's marriage, and when Bainbridge had shown signs of unraveling, hinting at past sins, threatening to reveal long-buried truths, she'd acted decisively, but why flee now? Because something had changed, something she hadn't anticipated. Alice, the girl she'd tried to erase, had remembered, recognized Bainbridge, had begun asking questions, had seen her with the bundle in the corridor, and that had ruined the script. Fenchurch's thoughts were interrupted by Merryweather's return, breathless. "Cooper's gone, sir. Took one of the bicycles from the lower stable. Tire tracks lead toward the woods. Alert the station. Lock down the road to Hartley. Set a watch at the rail, and notify Border Control she may try to leave the country." Merryweather nodded and dashed off. Fenchurch returned to the kitchen, where Alice now stood under the warm light. Her breath was stronger, and a deep purple bruise was forming above her eye. "She tried to strangle me," she rasped. "Not just knock me out." Fenchurch crouched beside her. "Did you see her?" "I heard her, breathing. She said something." "What?" Alice squinted, trying to remember. She said, "You were never supposed to know. He promised me you wouldn't remember." Fenchurch closed his eyes. Bainbridge had made a fatal promise. He had convinced Honoria that Alice, with her lost memories and forgotten trauma, would never connect the past, that inviting her here would provide closure, not threat. But Alice had remembered, and Honoria, realizing the bluff had failed, had lashed out. Now, with her control slipping and her co-conspirators exposed, she had fled into the fog with her loyal servant and whatever secrets remained in her possession, not just to avoid justice but to keep the truth sealed, the real truth, about Bainbridge, about Alice's parents, about who had ordered silence 30 years ago and who had enforced it. The inspector stood slowly. The game had changed. The killer was no longer playing to win. She was playing to vanish. And if he didn't catch her soon, she might just succeed. The frost had begun to lace the manor windows by the time Inspector Fenchurch stepped back into the library, the hearth still unlit, the air colder now than at any point in the investigation. The house was in lockdown. Cooper and Lady Honoria were missing. Alice rested under a watchful eye, and Delaney slumped in the study, had taken to muttering under his breath, repeating the phrase "she was always in charge" like a mantra. Cedric refused to speak at all. But Fenchurch wasn't interested in their silence. Not now. He paced the room alone, mentally tracing the entire timeline again, every word spoken, every object moved, every silence that had been too precise. The night had been a misdirection. The letters had vanished. Honoria had nearly killed Alice, then disappeared. Every event chaotic, violent, frantic. But beneath it all, something orderly remained, something deliberate. His eyes caught the chessboard on Bainbridge's desk again, now untouched, and for the first time, Fenchurch didn't just look at the pieces. He looked at the board itself. It had been reset. After the murder, someone had arranged the pieces before the constables arrived, but not to match the game that had been interrupted. No, this configuration was different. It was too balanced, too clean. He knelt, eyes narrowing. Black queen directly opposite white king. Rooks mirrored. Knights on B2 and G7 unusual. Even more unusual, the central pawn structure. It wasn't from a mid-game. It was from an opening, one he'd seen before. The Nimzowitsch defense, a rare, unorthodox strategy. Defensive, unpredictable, designed to control indirectly, to bait the opponent into overextension. And suddenly, the phrase slammed into his mind like a bullet. The knight is the most dangerous piece. It moves unlike anything else. Lady Honoria's words. Not poetic, not symbolic. Literal. A subtle nod, no, a signature. She had arranged the board after Bainbridge was dead. Not as a tribute, as a message. Because she hadn't panicked. She hadn't fled in fear. She had planned her disappearance like the next move in a match. He stood abruptly. His breath caught as the pattern began snapping into place, fast and cruel. She had always left markers. The ribbon in the hallway after dinner, the same pale blue as the one Bainbridge had worn to the 1923 memorial in Yorkshire. A fact only someone with access to his private journal would know. The wine selection for the final dinner, a Hungarian red from 1923, vintage symbolism, intentional. And then the one moment that returned to him now sharp overlooked, that first night, just before dinner, when he had asked the guests to wait. In the drawing room, Alice had been sketching by the window, Cedric had been at the drinks table, Delaney had drifted to the piano, and Honoria, she had walked the perimeter of the room, trailing her fingers across the bookshelf. She had paused. At one volume, The Art of Deception. It wasn't a coincidence that the red book with the newspaper clipping had been discovered there. Later, she had placed it, or ensured he would, which meant she had wanted the past to resurface, but not fully, not cleanly. She wanted the memory of the Withers case to come back, but fragmented, riddled with misdirection. Bainbridge's death had always been a part of that puzzle, but she had constructed it to frame Delaney, to push suspicion toward Cedric, and ultimately, to eliminate Alice if necessary, because Bainbridge had confessed to her in writing. Fenchurch whirled toward the fireplace, where only ashes remained now from the attempted destruction of the Czech knight. But not all of the ashes were from wood. Among them was the twisted metal base, and a sliver of parchment, burned at the edge, the faint curl of ink still visible. He retrieved it with tweezers and placed it carefully on the desk. The ink had run, but two words were still legible: Elmhurst and forgive. It wasn't a note to blackmail anyone. It had been Bainbridge's confession. He hadn't just feared exposure. He had been trying to atone, perhaps even planning to announce it at dinner, when all parties were present. That was why he had invited Alice, not just to corner her, to apologize. Honoria couldn't allow it. The threads were tightening now, pulled taut between past and present. Fenchurch stepped to the window and stared into the gathering dusk. Somewhere in the woods, or down an abandoned service road, she was moving like a night, indirect, oblique, never in a straight line. And then another detail flared to life. An image he hadn't thought significant until now. The family portrait in the corridor. Lord and Lady Bainbridge in their early years. Behind them, the estate in spring bloom. A carriage house stood just to the right, since demolished after the war, but in that painting, whole. But in the current estate map, there was a gap, an unlabeled space behind the eastern hedgerow, the old root cellar that had supposedly caved. And only Cedric had ever mentioned it, and only once, in passing. The whole area's unstable. We closed it off when the roof collapsed. But what if they hadn't? What if Honoria had kept it hidden, repaired it, reinforced it, used it? The night moves in L shapes, unpredictable, but always deliberate. He turned from the window. Merryweather, the constable, appeared immediately. We've been searching the wrong escape routes. I need a team with lanterns. We're going behind the eastern hedge line. There's something there they never told us about. Merryweather nodded without question and ran to gather the others. Fenchurch paused only once more at the chessboard before he followed. He placed the twisted fragment of the night beside the burned parchment and left them where they belonged together. The killer had hidden the truth in symbols and shadows, but the board was no longer in her control. The game had turned, and he knew her next move. By the time the eastern hedge gave way to rough stone and tangled undergrowth, the last light of day had bled into a bruised indigo sky. Lanterns flickered like the wisps as Fenchurch and Merryweather led the constables down a winding path that no longer appeared on any modern survey of the grounds. The air turned colder here, damper, heavy with the scent of earth and mildew. Ahead, barely visible through thorns and ivy, stood the remains of a low, moss-covered structure half buried in the soil, roof bowed inward under decades of neglect. Or, so it seemed. Fenchurch knelt by the wooden slats covering what had once been a root cellar entrance. His hand traced the rusted iron ring, freshly disturbed, when he lifted the boards. They moved too easily, new nails in old wood. He turned to Merryweather. She's been here before. This was always her final retreat. Lanterns shone into the darkness as they descended carefully. The steps were stone, old but intact, leading into a cold space no larger than a garden shed. The air was still, too still, then a sound, a breath, a shuffling movement dotted the far wall. A dim silhouette rose thin, composed, regal even now. Lady Honoria Bainbridge stood with her back to them, hair pinned, gloves on, her traveling case at her side. She didn't flinch as the lanterns illuminated the room. Her voice came calm, controlled. So the board was never mine, after all. Fenchurch stepped closer, revolver lowered but firm in his grip. You always knew how the pieces moved. You just didn't expect the opponent to think 3 steps ahead. She turned slowly to face him, eyes hollow but defiant. Is Alice alive? She is. A flicker relief or disappointment. Impossible to tell. I suppose you're here for the confession. Honoria said softly. I'm here for the truth, not the script you rehearsed for the court. She gave a brittle smile and walked to the small table in the center of the room. On it lay a worn leather-bound book, Bainbridge's private journal. She opened it with practiced fingers, turned to a marked page, then looked up. Do you know what he did to them? To Alice's parents, to me, she whispered. Fenchurch said nothing. I wasn't his first wife. I wasn't even meant to be. He was already engaged to Eleanor Withers when I met him. But she was inconvenient, idealistic, sharp-tongued, dangerous to a man like him. When she discovered what he was doing, how he was forging land claims and coercing donations to his charities, she threatened to expose him. And then she disappeared. Fenchurch said no, Honoria corrected. Then she died, along with her husband, in a house fire, one the coroner ruled accidental. But Bainbridge lit that match, and I married him 2 months later. Fenchurch stared at her. You knew. Of course I knew. I saw the change. In him, the hollow way he spoke about the fire, the way he avoided naming her. He tried to hide the records, burn letters, destroy photos, but the guilt rotted him from the inside. Then why protect him? Because I thought I could fix it, shape the story, preserve what he had built. If the truth came out, the entire Bainbridge Trust would collapse, scholarships, charities, land holdings. Hundreds of people would suffer. So you became the architect of the lie, Fenchurch said quietly. I became its custodian, she snapped, until he grew weak, until he tried to drag it all into the light again. Alice arrived and he saw a second chance at redemption. But redemption meant destruction for him, for me, for everything we'd built. And you couldn't allow that. I begged him, she said, her voice breaking for the first time. I pleaded with him to stay silent, to protect the legacy. But he wouldn't. He was going to read that letter at dinner, apologize to Alice, publicly, offer reparations. She looked up at Fenchurch with raw hatred and sadness swirling behind her eyes. So I killed him. I waited until he was alone, sitting with that damned journal in his lap, and I poisoned his wine with digitalis, fast, painless. Then I staged the scene, the night, the candle, the foreign piece in the tray. It was all supposed to point elsewhere, and it would have, if Alice hadn't remembered. Why not kill her too? Fenchurch asked, his voice cold. I tried, she said without flinching, but even then, I hesitated. I didn't want her dead. I just wanted her silent. Fenchurch took a step closer. You murdered a man in cold blood, tried to murder a second, and manipulated everyone around you into protecting your secret. You say it was for the greater good, but you only ever protected one thing, control. Honoria lowered her gaze to the journal. I protected order, she said, because the alternative was chaos. Fenchurch reached for the book, but she snapped it closed and held it tight against her chest. This doesn't leave with you, it's evidence. He said, it's my life, she replied. There was a long silence, only the breathing of the men behind him and the low rustling of the trees outside. Then Fenchurch said quietly, you never stopped loving her, did you, Eleanor? Honoria's hands trembled. I loved her more than he ever did, and he destroyed her. She finally held out the journal, slowly, hands shaking. He deserved to die for that, but I suppose I do too. Fenchurch took the journal and gestured for the constables to move in. As they took Honoria's arms and began to escort her out, she looked around the cellar one last time, the strange sanctuary she had built, stone by stone, lie by lie, and then, without resisting, she disappeared into the night. Outside, Fenchurch stood for a long moment, the journal heavy in his hands. The motive had not been money, or power, or vengeance. It had been grief, twisted, buried, unresolved grief, and the truth of it was heavier than any crime. Elmhurst Manor stood in a hush, the kind that follows a confession but precedes judgment. The lanterns had been extinguished, the Constables had departed with Lady Honoria in custody. Snow had begun to fall light, silent flakes swirling across the gravel paths and settling atop the hedgerows like a clean sheet, pulled over a wounded body. But inside, no one slept. Inspector Fenchurch remained in the library, the journal open in front of him, every page annotated in Bainbridge's tight, slanted hand. The entries stretched back decades: fraud, manipulation, coercion, but threaded through it all one name, repeated like a refrain: Eleanor Withers. And always guilt. The case was closed in the eyes of the law. Honoria had confessed, her motive laid bare, the murder explained. But something still clawed at the edges of Fenchurch's thoughts, a subtle wrongness, like a note out of key. The night, the check piece, burned, planted, then stolen, the letter, the staged positioning of the chessboard. Yes, Honoria had engineered the deception, but she hadn't done it alone. She hadn't moved that night into his room. That had happened before the murder. He flipped back through Bainbridge's last entries. One dated 3 days before the dinner stood out. She said the girl would remember, that I must make peace with the truth, that I must leave a sign, not Honoria's words, someone else's. He rose slowly, the realization blooming like frost beneath the skin. There had been a second architect, not a killer but a guide, someone who'd nudged events forward just enough, someone who believed the truth had to surface, and someone still within these walls. Alice. She stood in the gallery when he found her, staring out through the frosted glass at the snow-covered lawn. She didn't flinch when he approached. Her face was pale but resolute. "You knew," he said softly. She nodded once. "I didn't know everything, but I remembered enough." He stepped beside her. "You moved the night." She turned to face him. "Yes, before the dinner. I went to his room that morning. I confronted him." "You remembered who he was?" "Not at first," she whispered. "But when I saw the picture of Eleanor in the guest book, it came back. The voice, the fire, my mother screaming his name, Bainbridge." Fenchurch said nothing. "I asked him why he brought me here. He cried. I'd never seen a man unravel like that. He said he was sorry, that he didn't light the fire himself, but he didn't stop it either. He blamed Honoria, said she pushed him to silence Eleanor. But I didn't believe him, not entirely. He was still the one who benefited. So you left a message, the night," she said. "I wanted him to look at it, to see the piece that didn't belong. Like me, I thought maybe he'd take it as a sign that it wasn't too late to confess." Fenchurch's voice was quiet. "He almost did. I didn't want him dead," Alice said, eyes brimming now. "I just wanted him to say it, out loud, to own what he did to my family. You were the only person in this house who knew the truth and never tried to weaponize it." She smiled bitterly. "Except I did weaponize it. Just not with poison." He studied her for a long moment. "You knew Honoria would break. I wasn't sure, but I hoped she'd panic, that she'd try to bury the truth again. And in doing so, reveal it." He leaned on the window sill, the snow behind them like falling ash. "You baited her. She destroyed my parents," Alice said. "She tried to kill me. I wasn't going to let her control the story forever." Fenchurch exhaled. The trap had never been his. It had been hers, from the moment she remembered. Alice had set the final game in motion. "And yet, one thing I don't understand," he said. "Why not tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't trust you," she said honestly. "Not at first. Not until you saw through Delaney, and Cedric, and her." There was no malice in her tone, just quiet fatigue. "I wanted the truth to come out," she said, "but it had to come out the right way, not in pieces, not with you chasing shadows." He nodded, and for the first time that day, allowed himself the smallest measure of relief. "You should know," he said. "Cooper's been found. He was waiting at the train station with her ticket. He says she told him everything, that she confessed Bainbridge killed the Withers, that she promised to set things right one way or another. Do you believe her?" "I believe she believed it." Alice turned back toward the window. "What happens now?" Fenchurch looked out with her, snow dusting the stone angels in the garden, the hedges, the roof tiles. "Now," he said, "now you decide what justice looks like." She said nothing, and he didn't press her. She had already answered that question with silence, with memory, with a night left where it didn't belong later. As the constables prepared to escort Delaney to a holding cell, Cedric emerged from the smoking room. His eyes were rimmed red, hands trembling as he approached Alice. "I didn't know," he whispered. "About your mother, or the fire." Alice didn't respond. "I thought I was protecting the estate." He added, "You were protecting the illusion," she said quietly. "That's all Elmhurst ever was." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Fenchurch stepped between them, not to interfere, but to signal that the story was done. Alice glanced at the inspector once more, her expression unreadable, and then she walked past them both through the grand doors, into the falling snow. No drama, no parting words. The final move had been made, and the game, at last, was over. The snow thickened as the hours passed, softening the landscape until Elmhurst seemed part of a faded painting. Its hard edges blurred beneath white silence. Fenchurch remained behind long after the others had gone, after Alice disappeared into the swirling dusk, after Cedric retreated to his shame, after the constables had transported the final suspects into custody. The manor, now quiet as the grave, seemed determined to swallow what was left of the truth. He stood once more in the library, the final battlefield. The journal rested beneath his hand. He should have felt satisfied. Closure had been delivered. With surgical precision, motive, method, confession. Honoria Bainbridge would never see another garden party. The ghosts had names now. Alice had walked away whole, and yet he couldn't leave. Not yet. There was something missing. Not wrong, precisely, not broken, but missing. He turned to the hearth again. The ashes were cold now, untouched since they'd retrieved the night's remnants. But the desk drawer, he hadn't opened it since the night of the murder. He slid it out now, still neatly arranged, ledgers, old receipts, a fountain pen, to correspondence knives. But one object caught his eye, a key, small, brass, ornate, not a house key, older. Fenchurch rolled it between his fingers. This hadn't been here the night Bainbridge died. That drawer had been checked thoroughly. Someone had put this here. After Fenchurch turned it over, engraved on the underside, barely legible in the dim light, was a single letter, M. He looked around the room again. No lock visible, no matching brass finish. But then he remembered the curio cabinet in the corner, largely ignored, its contents ornamental. He walked over, examined the small latch near its base. Locked. The key slid in as if invited. The cabinet door clicked open. Inside were two levels. The top held fine porcelain, the bottom a leather-bound ledger, dustless, untouched by time. Fenchurch pulled it free. Not Bainbridge's handwriting. Different, upright, formal. Dated entries beginning in 1902. The name embossed on the inner cover made his breath still. Michael Withers. He sat, the room suddenly colder, though the fire had been long. Dead. Michael Withers, Alice's father, and this was his journal. He skimmed the first few pages. Finance logs, land transactions, estate business. Then the tone shifted. Letters copied verbatim. One addressed to a benefactor, another undated to Bainbridge himself. "I will not keep silent, no matter the threats. Eleanor's trust in you was misplaced. If this reaches your hands, it will be the end of our friendship, and perhaps the end of everything." Fenchurch's eyes sharpened. This wasn't a man manipulated into ruin. This was someone fighting back. And then came the final entry, short, blunt. "She told me about the funds being diverted. Said she had proof. She feared Honoria more than Bainbridge. Said it wasn't his idea, that it started before he ever came to Elmhurst." His breath caught. Honoria hadn't been the mastermind. She'd taken control, but the rot had already started. The real architect had been Eleanor's friend, her trusted confidant, the one who had supported her charity efforts, her estate work, her private education initiatives. Lady Margaret Everleigh. Fenchurch stood so quickly the journal fell from his lap. Lady Everleigh, the matriarch of the Everleigh estate, recently deceased, widely respected, benefactor to half the county. She had died quietly just months ago. Old age, unquestioned. Her estate passed to a private trust. But Margaret had been the true power behind Elmhurst in its earliest days, mentor to Honoria, friend to Eleanor, and betrayer of both. She had laundered the money from Eleanor's charities, diverted donations, and when Eleanor uncovered it, Margaret hadn't silenced her directly. She had whispered to Bainbridge, fed him fear, fed Honoria ambition. She engineered the murder without ever lifting a hand, a ghost behind ghosts. And then, years later, when Bainbridge began unraveling, she'd returned, not publicly but through Cooper, through others. Fenchurch remembered the sealed envelope found in Bainbridge's room, unsigned but marked with the Everleigh seal. He had dismissed it as ceremonial, left over from an old alliance, but it had been a warning, a reminder that the real puppeteer never truly left the theater. Fenchurch's hands trembled as he closed the journal. The mastermind was gone now, died before the case ever opened. The law would never touch her. But the truth could. Alice had left Elmhurst believing she had her answer, that Bainbridge's guilt and Honoria's obsession had explained it all, but they were only ever instruments. The real music had been composed by someone else entirely. He tucked the ledger into his coat and stepped out into the snow. The flakes had grown heavier now, painting the world in white lies, but beneath it, the bones of truth remained. He would find Alice. He would give her the final piece of the story. And perhaps, at long last, the silence could end. The train to London hissed with steam as it prepared to pull away from the quiet country platform, the foggy morning rolling across the tracks in slow, lazy swirls. Inspector Fenchurch spotted Alice at the far end of the platform, her coat wrapped tight against the cold, a battered satchel at her side. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You always seem to know where I'll be," she said. "It's part of the job." He reached into his coat and pulled out the journal, bound in cracked leather, its pages worn by time and hidden hands. He offered it to her. "Your father's." She stared at it, her expression unreadable. "I thought it was lost in the fire." He hid it in a cabinet sealed with a key marked M. She took it with both hands as she turned it over and opened to the pages. Her lips parted slightly. Then she closed it and looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "So she was the one, Lady Everleigh. The evidence points to her as the origin. She orchestrated the financial diversion. Eleanor discovered it. When she tried to expose the truth, Lady Everleigh didn't silence her directly. She used the people closest to her. Bainbridge, Honoria." Alice nodded slowly. The puppeteer. She didn't need to commit murder, just suggest it. Plant ideas, use influence. Once the dominoes were in place, she simply waited. "But she's dead." Fenchurch didn't answer immediately. "Yes and no." Alice tilted her head, puzzled. "Her estate is now run by the Everleigh Trust," he explained. "Privately administered. But one of the trustees is Cooper, another is Cedric. Quiet appointments, easily missed unless you know where to look." Alice's eyes widened slightly. "They're still managing the fortune." "Exactly. They say it's for public good, arts, restoration, rural education. But the financial trails suggest it's being used to shield certain investments, bury old transactions, and suppress investigation into property seizures dating back 25 years. She clenched her hands around the journal. "So even in death, she's escaping justice." Fenchurch's tone was calm. "Not entirely. There's still the matter of the Withers fire. A full inquiry could reopen the case, link it to the embezzlement. There's no statute of limitations on murder. But without a living perpetrator, someone must still carry the burden of accountability," he said. "Cooper claims he knew nothing. Cedric says he was just a boy at the time. Maybe that's true, maybe not." Alice stared out at the rails stretching off into the distance. "Then what happens now?" "I've submitted everything to the Crown Office," he said. "The journal, the correspondence, your testimony if you're willing." She nodded. "I am." Fenchurch hesitated before speaking again. "There was one final thing. The night," her brow furrowed. "I told you. I placed it there before dinner." "You did," he said, "but that wasn't the only time it appeared." He reached into his pocket and drew out a photograph, brittle at the edges. It showed Bainbridge's study in 1923, long before the fire, when the Withers estate was still. Whole, on the bookshelf clearly visible, sat the check knight. Alice studied it in silence. "I thought you found it at a market," she said. "I did." But that particular piece had been at Elmhurst for years. Then it disappeared, until someone reintroduced it, quietly, to make a point. She looked up. Who? Fenchurch shrugged lightly. My guess, Honoria never removed it after Eleanor's death. She kept it hidden, maybe even forgot about it. But someone found it, used it, not just you. He paused. There was a reason Bainbridge reacted so strongly. When you placed it on the tray, it wasn't just guilt, it was recognition. He'd seen it before. In Eleanor's hand. Alice said nothing. Fenchurch stepped back and looked out toward the platform edge. We're never as clever as we think. He murmured. The pieces tell the story. We just have to stop trying to move them before we understand the game. The train let out a long, low whistle. Alice stepped toward the carriage, her hand still wrapped around the journal. Will you be all right? He asked. I think so, she said. It's not peace, but it's truth. He offered a faint smile. Close enough, sometimes. She paused at the doorway. You said there was no statute of limitations on murder. Does that mean the case isn't really over? Fenchurch met her eyes. The law says it might be. But the story, he tapped the side of his temple. The story keeps moving. She nodded once, then boarded the train. The doors shut behind her with a click that sounded final. He watched the carriage pull away into the fog. As it disappeared, he realized he was holding something in his coat pocket, a note, folded once, no envelope. He unfolded it slowly. It was addressed to him. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but elegant. Some truths are too heavy to be spoken, even when the world demands them. But you saw the whole board. That's more than most ever do. No signature, no date. Just a letter left by someone who'd seen the end long before it arrived. Fenchurch slipped the note back into his coat. The station was empty now. The only sound the wind brushing against the iron rails. Justice had come in fragments, never pure, never complete. The villain was dead, but her influence lingered. The pawns had suffered, the knights had fallen, and the queen had been captured only after tipping her own hand. But the detective had stayed on his feet, and in the end, that was what mattered. Because some stories don't end with justice, they end with understanding. Snow had stopped falling by the time Inspector Fenchurch reached the edge of Elmhurst's long drive, the sky breaking open into a dull, reluctant blue. The air carried the scent of thaw-wet soil, damp stone, cold iron. Behind him, the manor loomed silent, shuttered, its secrets scattered like forgotten chess pieces in the corners of every room. He passed through the gates without looking back. Some closures didn't require ceremony. His boots crunched across the gravel path, the road winding past frost-brittle hedgerows and sleeping orchards. He thought of the letter again, the final, unsigned message left for him on the platform. The way it hinted, rather than confessed, a quiet acknowledgement, a salute, even. He considered burning it, but didn't. Fenchurch had always believed endings were for novels, not for real cases. In truth, cases never ended, they simply grew quieter, and the people left in their wake either learned to live with the echoes, or chased them until they became something else entirely. Or still, the Bainbridge affair had settled into its place. Alice had her truth, the press had their villain, the trust had its reckoning, however incomplete. Even Cedric, in his own way, had taken the first unsteady steps toward redemption. He'd agreed to testify. Cooper had resigned from the Everleigh Trust under public scrutiny. And yet, one detail still tugged at Fenchurch's thoughts, not loud, not urgent, but like a thread just slightly out of place in an otherwise immaculate weave. It was the first note, the one Bainbridge had allegedly left for Alice, the one found burned, with only the seal surviving. Everyone had assumed Honoria destroyed it to erase her husband's confession. But something had never quite fit. Honoria hadn't known what Alice remembered. Not until the night of the dinner. By then, it was too late to stage an elaborate misdirection, especially not one that would risk drawing attention to the check knight and the chessboard dots. So who had burned the letter? He paused at the crest of the hill, pulling his coat tighter. Back, in the study, when he'd opened the curio cabinet, the knight's remains hadn't been alone. There had been wax shavings too. Silver, sealing wax. Honoria wouldn't have used it. She preferred ink stamps that left one person, Cooper. He'd vanished after Lady Everleigh's death, only to resurface just before the dinner. Said he came to help manage the estate, said he'd been summoned. But no one ever confirmed who had summoned him, and that meant Fenchurch turned slowly, eyes drifting down the road, lost in thought. The night wasn't just a symbol of Eleanor's legacy, it was also a warning. Someone had reintroduced it to trigger memory, to agitate the board. A cat list masquerading as a relic. It had been placed precisely, and while Alice had moved the night, she had not been the one to recover it from the market stall in the village. That was Cooper's job. He'd delivered the chess set to Bainbridge 2 days before the dinner, said it was part of the estate inventory, said it had resurfaced. Another lie. Cooper hadn't just been a passive accomplice to Lady Everleigh's schemes. He had ensured they endured. A custodian of her intent, a man who had seen what her influence could do and had chosen to preserve it quietly, methodically. And when Bainbridge had threatened to confess, Cooper hadn't tried to stop him outright. He had made it look like someone else had done it. He had let Honoria take the fall. He had orchestrated her confession by nudging every piece just enough, placing the night, fanning Bainbridge's guilt, ensuring Alice remembered just enough to provoke Honoria's fear. No fingerprints, no confrontation, only shadows, and Fenchurch hadn't seen it. He had watched the game and missed the hand that set the board. Now, Cooper was gone again, vanished, not arrested, not even questioned after the confession. A ghost, smiling in the dark. The inspector's lips drew into a thin line. He would find him, eventually. There were only so many corners of England where a man like Cooper could hide. The kind of man who didn't kill with blades or poison but with silence and patience, and the conviction that justice could be rewritten if the ink was dry enough. Fenchurch reached the road and turned east. He would report what he'd found, submit it properly, of course, a formal request to reopen Cooper's role in the investigation. A quiet inquiry to Scotland Yard. Nothing dramatic. Just the next piece on the board. Because while the Bainbridge mystery was closed in public, in truth it had only ever been one movement in a much longer game. He glanced down at the note again. You saw the whole board. He folded it carefully, tucked it into his coat, and walked on into the morning, boots striking rhythm against stone. His silhouette swallowed slowly by mist. Behind him, Elmhurst Manor kept its secrets close, but not forever.